Why are there stories? And what can looking at prehistory help us see? And I'm going to make the argument that stories are intrinsically linked to reasoning and thinking. And it seems like there's no connection, but they're intrinsically linked, and thinking does not happen without stories. Because stories, it sounds like they're just like made up, and they're often like mythical, but specifically mythical stories. Myths are crucial to thinking. And I'm going to talk about mythic thinking and symbolic thinking or story thinking. And I'm going to talk about phenomenology, the phenomenology of perception. How do I perceive anything? And how stories are involved, and pattern recognition and signal among noise and erotic comprehension. What does eros have to do with comprehension? Seems like it's a block of comprehension. And it can be, but it's also intrinsically linked to it. So we're going to take a step back and think about it in terms of prehistory and where did we all come from? And let's go back 3.3 million years. And let's go to the Paleolithic age. And I'm not going to go through, like, there's a whole lot of history and prehistory here, but just hitting some highlights. The lower Paleolithic age, 3.3 million years to 300,000 years BP, before the present. In that large expanse of time when our ancestors were, doing some hunting and gathering, and they start to eat meat. And about 2 million years ago, as far as we know, meat eating becomes more and more common. First, probably like scavenging, but then hunting. The whole concept of hunting changes humanity, or these pre-humans. Pair bonding. Why pair bonding in carnivores? Because women hunt as well, but men are designed to hunt. And then when you also have babies and children, and then someone's got to go run away and hunt, and someone's got to stay, it becomes very valuable to have this long-term, you don't know how long, but long-term pair bonding. And at this time, because you're hunting, you're using tools, you got to break bones, you got to like start using stones, you got to start making tools and more complex tools. And then you have the upper Paleolithic, which is 50,000 or so years ago, and you have multi-piece tools, and you have much more complex tools, and this leads to a huge transformation of the entire society in that short period of time, in that like 70 to 50,000 years ago time period. Homo sapiens are developing way more tools and way more complex social interactions. And then about 12,000 years ago, the Neolithic revolution, the end of that first or that last glacial period, agriculture, growing stuff, which means you're staying in one place and you're building a village and you're domesticating animals and you're starting to make pottery. And so these things are gonna shape our purposes, our projects, And that's going to be involved in stories. And the way we think are going to be involved in those stories and the stories that we tell, because they didn't even before that writing. They're telling stories. And so we're going to get to that at the end. But let's say a few more things here. 11,700, they say, years ago, or 9,700 BCE. That is what we're talking about, this big transformation into widespread agriculture. And then 3,300 or so, the Bronze Age, and the Bronze Age collapsed in 1200. So then there was a kind of crisis, which is going to lead into the Axial Age, which we'll talk more about next time. But using bronze implements, and then that's going to change with that collapse, and then the transformation into the Iron Age around 1200 BCE and then there's a whole lot of different time periods that it could be, but let's say 500 BCE, this Iron Age, huge growth of population, huge development of thought in the Axial Age. And in that Axial Age, the great thinkers, Buddha and Socrates, Zoroaster, Confucius, Lao Tzu, and many others, the Jewish thinkers, Deutero Isaiah. I mean, there's also Isaiah, but also like the second Isaiah, Deutero Isaiah, in the Jewish tradition and the Hebrew tradition, using stories, analyzing stories, myths. And so when people are hunters and gatherers, and they're using their stories to teach each other and inspire each other too, because you need to motivate yourself and others, and you're using myths and stories and images and paintings now and songs. And let's take a step back to the technologies surrounding cooking. And before you could cook, think about chimpanzees for a second, and how, if you watch chimpanzees, I haven't, but I've read about this, they're basically eating all day because they have to, and they're eating vegetables, they're eating plants, and it takes a long time to chew and to process and then digest, and that's because that's all they have are leaves. And that's great. But when you cook and you're eating meat, then you can eat much more quickly. And let's say in an hour, which means you have way more time for the rest of the day to do other stuff, to do hunting, to do creating of art, to do storytelling. And the leisure that is the beginning of culture. And we don't know exactly when people started to cook. About 30,000 years ago, we see evidence of earth ovens, but certainly people were cooking before that. But maybe 1 million years ago, starting like primitive types of cooking. But 30,000 years ago, we have these ovens. And so let me take a swig of my water here. I'm getting excited. Wow. Yeah, it's exciting stuff. And so in these prehistoric times, mythic stories, ritualized myths around the fire with music and chanting and poetic. That's how they would memorize these stories. They would be poems. And when we get to the modern times, in 1500s, 1600s, 1700s, and people thought, oh, these myths, they're kind of nice window dressing, but we can kind of just get rid of them, and that's not going to change anything. And then it leads to the meaning crisis and all kinds of crises, and the modernity crisis, like the environmental crises, the environment of our souls crises, the loneliness crises. Like there's problems in modernity. And I'm saying that it's partly because we just disposed of all this mythic thinking, thinking we didn't need it anymore. That we could just use it as like a video game fun break, but it's not really crucial to the real living. But it is crucial. Symbolic thinking, imaginative thinking, developing our imaginations. It's not just this kind of pretty image on the inside my frame that I used to decorate my little frame, but otherwise the frame's just blank and meaningless. No, the world is really full and interwoven with meaning. We need to cultivate the capacity to perceive them, to have that perception of meaning. And so let's go to the drawing board. And talk about these two models of thinking, the intellectualist knowing and erotic or embodied knowing. What do I mean by this? And by the way, this is what modernity brings. And I'm not anti-modern, but I'm pro-modern, but I want to keep the mythic thinking and the embodied thinking. And so we need a different version, and it's already there in many forms, but we need to really develop this. So let's look at this distinction where we have an intellectualist model where I think of myself as an information processor. I'm kind of like a computer, like a little AI, like Chat GPT. And I'm not even as smart as ChatGPT. I don't have as much memory, and I don't write as well as ChatGPT sometimes. But no, we're an intuitor. We intuit. We have deeper ways of seeing the whole, seeing wholes, not just the pieces. That's involved with erotic imaginative thinking. And in this intellectualist model of knowing, we focus on the fact that I can think, I can move, and that's it. That's all I need to do. No, but with this other model, I have embodied thinking. And I partly have muscle memory, and I partly I'm thinking, even as I'm thinking about the metaphors of I'm moving up, I'm moving forward, I'm moving backward. Like you couldn't do those thoughts without having a body. And I see meaning in a sense in the world, but in my experience of the world. That I'm not faking those meanings. I'm not like projecting those false meanings. You can project false meanings and you can fool yourself. But if you cultivate wisdom, you can find out when you're self-deceiving. You can have a wisdom tradition and a wisdom methodology, a philosophy that can help you do that and have a truly perceptive sense of meaning. Getting back to the intellectualist model, they think first I have a perception. First I see a deer running in the woods, and then I have a meaning. Oh, that means I can go hunt it. No, it's all in one go. the meaning in fact, the meaning comes first, really. And it's all about how my body aims at the world. I'm aiming myself at the world at all times. There's never a moment. I mean, I suppose I could like abstract and meditate, and then I'm not having any aim. But in general, I'm always already aiming. In the intellectualist model, consciousness means I think that. We could get into Descartes here, but I'm not going to do that. We can do that some other time. But in a better model, consciousness is I can do this or that. I can. I've got a project. I've got an aim. I'm living. I'm not just a disembodied brain. And this is where I'm using my imagination at all times. Not to make up like fairy stories that are fake. I mean, I'm going to defend fairy stories another time, but imagination is where what? Embodiment and habit meet. That these two things are happening together in my imagination. And I cultivate my imagination by stories, by ritualized stories and myths. And so good. So let's say some more things about that. As I was saying, we're talking about experience, and an intellectualist or a kind of overly scientific analytic mode is too focused on discourse and like the words and the languages that we put on meaning, on the universe or on our experience. But our experience of meaning comes first, and then the facts, and then the objects, and then like the deer that I'm hunting, the individual things, the propositions. I see a deer, the lazy, or the dog jumps over the lazy wolf. That anyway, seeing some objects there. Let's talk about Merleau-Ponty and a patient that he writes about named Johann Schneider, who had ataxia, ataxia, which means without coordination, or he and I don't know exactly the details of Schneider himself's condition, but someone I know who I met who had ataxia, as he was getting older, he had some brain injuries, some strokes, and so he could walk and he could talk and he could move, but he couldn't start walking without a prompt. So he had this stick with a little side stick that would come out, like he'd press the button and the side stick would come out, and he'd put it in front of his feet and he'd press it so the thing would come out, and then he could step over that thing because it gave him something to step over. And so he couldn't coordinate start walking. He could walk, he had the physical ability to walk, but there was something in his perception of the world and his perception of life where it was hard, and he really had a hard time. And he had also coordination problems, and he had a walker and all these other things that were related to that as well. But Schneider, this person that's Merleau-Ponty, this is the French philosopher Merleau-Ponty, Maurice Merleau-Ponty. He died in the early 1960s. He was a colleague of Jean-Paul Sartre, and I think they edited a magazine at some point together. He was a professor in Paris, I think Paris. I'll check that. but brilliant philosopher, wrote a book called The Phenomenology of Perception, was really insightful about how our knowing works through our bodies, and has to happen through them. And so he writes about Schneider, who has a brain injury, and that brain injury is useful because it's a useful way of thinking about the things that we take for granted, like ataxia, like having to start walking, or being able to perceive objects as a whole. And there's the story of how they held up, I think it was a pencil, mechanical pencil, like this, although not silver, up to Schneider, and they said, "Hey, what is this?" And he said, "Oh, it's cylindrical, it's thin, like a stick. It could be used as a stick. It's yellow," or whatever color it was. And then he turned it around and you could see the clip. Oh, it's a pencil. And he couldn't see the whole. He could see the pieces and the parts. But until he saw like the functionality, like, oh, you can click this thing, and then he saw what it was. And so this is like an intellectualist mode is almost like having a brain injury, I guess I'm saying. And Merleau-Ponty is saying that you're shutting off part of your brain, which is this imaginative, erotic, embodied, storied part of your thinking and your brain. And they said in a book by a philosopher named Jamie Smith, it's probably one of the most common names in the world, James Smith. But anyway, he goes by Jamie, and his writerly name is James K.A. Smith. That way you don't get him mixed up with other people. James K.A. Smith. And the book is called Imagining the Kingdom. He's a philosopher theologian, and there's some Christian material in there. But the part that I'm focusing on is he says that Schneider could do his homework in a strip club. This person would be taking off their clothes in front of him and doing all kinds of stuff. And he'd be like, oh, that's interesting. Someone's taking off their shirt. Someone's like moving their leg. But he couldn't get what was going on. He couldn't see the whole. He couldn't tell if someone was flirting with him. He couldn't get stories. Like he could repeat a series of facts back to you, but like to see the whole story, like this story arc, where it was going, he couldn't tell. And I don't know if they have analysis of his musicality. I wonder if he was able to get melodies or like sort of movements in a song. Like, could he see those whole? Those are the kind of things that he had a hard time grasping. Genres, styles, like the style of dress. Could he match his tie? I suspect not. I mean, a lot of people can't match their ties, but anyway, people don't wear ties anymore. But yeah, so thinking about this disabled person, Schneider, and his disability as a way of thinking about our normal abilities of thinking with our bodies, with our erotic comprehension, not just abstractly, not just analyzing intellectually, but feeling the force of a truth that exceeds analysis, that I'm not just seeing a fact, that I'm feeling a force of a truth, a meaning. I'm grasping by my imagination, a story arc. I'm catching something like a dance, like I can kind of like move my body, but at a certain point I catch the dance and I'm like really like in the flow. Like it's like being in flow. It's like grasping a work of art. Its meaning, a painting, let's say by Picasso or Van Gogh, its meaning is interwoven between its materiality and its meaning, that they go together. So again, let me get back to the original question. Why stories? Why myths? Let me take a drink of water again. And why think about prehistoric hominids, hunter-gatherers? Because that's where the stories start. And the hunters at Lascaux in France, let me try and get a picture here. They would go into the cave, which was dark at night, and they'd have a fire, and they would have a ritual, and they might bang on some drums, and they might have a chant, and they might have a shaman who would tell the story and maybe sing the story of the hunt for the yak or the horse or the, I'm not sure what these animals are, bison, whatever this was in France, carabao, whatever. They would be telling the story of the hunt, and the people would look at the painting and they would hear the story and they would feel the embodied experience, and the kind of, might even be like some kind of peyote smoke and a kind of incense, and really ritualized storytelling. And that this was shaping and inspiring the next hunters, and they was like, yes, and they would get excited, like watching a movie. Like we'd go into a movie theater today and it's the Fast and the Furious and the car chase, and but in this case, these are young people, well, all kinds of people, but especially the young people who are going to learn, and they're going to get inspired, and they're going to become growing in the embodied experience of this hunting story, and so that they can become great hunters themselves and serve their tribe. And so this is their purpose and their end. And so when they have these stories, these ritualized mythic stories, and this cultivates their imaginations and their mythic thinking, and this is going to help them live and survive. This is a survival fact. Humans have projects. They're going to be hunting. They're going to be building a hut. They're going to be mating. They're going to be reproducing and rearing a child. And so this is also going to like shape their stories. And so are these stories that they tell just practical responses to arbitrary facts of their biology, and like the fact that they need a hut, and the fact that they need to hunt, these biological facts, and the fact that they need to have sex to mate, and then it takes a long time to rear a child, much longer than other animals, and a lot of training and stories that they're going to pass from generation to generation? I don't know. I have my suspicions, but the fact is the stories are there, and the stories allow us to find the meaning of the world, and we see the patterns in the world from the stories that we've already imbibed and taken in. And you can let me take a step back, and an objection that people will have is that, well, you can have these false master narratives of oppression that like the rich people use to oppress the poor, and sure, that's true, but if you really have a wisdom tradition, you can find out when you're oppressing people, and we'll have some discussions of how not to oppress people, because that's an important thing. But you can't do anything without stories. So it's a kind of false modernistic thought that, oh, stories, you can't trust them because they're all oppressive, so let's just get outside of stories. But there's no outside of stories. There's no such thing. So we need to understand the stories, how they work, so that we can critique them. We also need to critique the stories so that we can see the impression. But we need the stories, the mating stories, the village stories. How do I negotiate a peace within this extended family, with this tribe, so that we don't all kill each other, fighting over something, fighting over land, thinking about the future, thinking about, are we going to move further inland, or are we going to stay here by this river? Like, we need stories so we can think these things through and think about our hunting, our purposes, and then thinking about our chosen ends, which are like, who am I? And who am I bonded with? Pair bonded with when I'm mating, bonded with in other forms when I'm hunting together, when I'm working together, when I'm building together. And that gives me my identity. And we can't live without an identity. These stories, this is another reason why there's a meaning crisis and a loneliness crisis and everything today, is because we have lost touch with these stories. And people don't read anymore. It's another thing. Read long books, novels, and histories, but novels. Read them. This will change your life. So that's what I've got for today. We'll be doing these weekly for now, and I look forward to further discussions.